Introducing my family. My name is Emily Kingsley, and if you'd asked anyone in Manhattan's Upper East Side a year ago, they'd have told you that the Kingsleys were the very picture of the American dream. Born into old money, I practically grew up with a silver spoon in my mouth. Luxury penthouses, summer homes in the Hamptons, invitations to exclusive charity galas. My father, Richard Kingsley, was the third-generation heir of our family's investment empire, while my mother, Catherine, came from a long line of Ivy League academics. From the outside, our family life seemed untouched by hardship. Our brownstone on East 72nd Street looked like something out of an architectural magazine. Marble floors, grand chandeliers, oil paintings of ancestors, watching over our every move. Every Christmas, the house would fill with the smell of pine and cinnamon, the kind of warmth reserved for holiday movies. My father was meticulous about upholding our family's image. He was the type of man who pressed his shirts himself and knew every employee at his firms by name. To the public, the Kingsley name meant integrity and tradition. Privately, he was reserved, a man of few words but commanding presence. My mother, on the other hand, ran our social calendar like a general, planning a military campaign. She was elegant, eloquent, and fiercely protective of our family's reputation. She always told me and my younger brother, Jordan, that we had to work twice as hard, because with privilege came responsibility. As a child, I attended the best schools, the kind where your classmates' last names graced the marble walls. There were ballroom dance lessons, etiquette classes, fencing on Wednesdays, and debates on Saturday mornings. My childhood was defined by discipline and expectation, kindness and constraint. And then there was my brother, Jordan, 3 years younger than I am. Jordan seemed to attract trouble the way moths are drawn to light, effortlessly and without regret. Where I followed rules, Jordan searched for loopholes. Still, my parents doted on him, perhaps because he was the only son, perhaps because he reminded them of their younger, more rebellious selves. Whatever the reason, our family dynamic often revolved around keeping Jordan in check. But beneath all the shine and social polish, there was always an undercurrent, an unspoken code that certain things were never discussed, at least not in polite company. My father's eyes would glaze over at the mere mention of family history. My mother would change the topic if any guest inquired a bit too curiously about our fortune's origins. I always sensed that our opulent life was built on more than just savvy investing and good taste, that the real story of the Kingsleys was more complicated, more fragile than the gilded surface would let on. Of course, for much of my life, I played along. I took pride in my lineage, in the house with its hidden staircases, in the centuries-old family crest embossed on every stationery. I felt loyalty to my parents, to our name, to the Kingsley legacy. Never in my wildest dreams did I suspect how quickly everything could unravel, or how the very family I cherished could become the source of my greatest heartbreak and transformation. The Kingsley story, I would soon learn, was not carved in marble, but etched in secrets. The shock of hearing the will-nothing in my carefully orchestrated, well-mannered life could have prepared me for the day my father's will was read. The city outside buzzed with its usual rhythm. Taxis darting across Madison Avenue, doormen tipping their hats as if the world was unchanging. But inside the mahogany-paneled office of Finch and Crowley, the law firm that had advised our family for decades, time seemed to slow to a point of suffocating stillness. My mother sat on my left, posture impeccable, lipstick perfect, even though her eyes were rimmed with red, betraying nights of silent grieving. My younger brother Jordan slouched beside her, scrolling idly through his phone as if this were another tedious social obligation he had to endure. Meanwhile, I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, forcing myself to remember Dad's last words to me. A half smile, a squeeze of the hand, an assurance, "Everything will be all right, Emmy." The lawyer, Mr. Benson, was an old friend of my father's, the kind of man who always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and leather-bound books. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. His voice was even and measured as he cataloged the specifics: charitable donations, artwork distributions, trust funds for various cousins and godchildren. My mind wandered. Would Dad's Monet go to Aunt Cecilia? Would the summer house finally be sold? Until suddenly, I heard my name. To my beloved daughter, Emily Kingsley. I instinctively straightened in my chair, prepared for the role I had always rehearsed: dutiful, appreciative, deserving. His next words crashed against me like icy waves. "I leave my love and lasting pride, but as per family tradition, all estate assets, properties, and controlling interest in Kingsley Holdings pass solely to my son, Jordan Kingsley." For a long moment, the air seemed to vanish from the room. I stared at Mr. Benson, waiting for him to continue, to laugh, to say, "Just kidding." But nothing came. My mother's lips trembled, her hand gripping her pearl necklace with white-knuckled intensity. Jordan blinked, more surprised than anyone, then let a slow and slightly smug smile spread across his face. It was as if a crack had appeared in the foundation of everything I had ever believed. My entire life, I had been told that being a Kingsley meant responsibility, honor, and, yes, privilege. But I had never imagined for a second that it also meant exclusion, solely because I was born a girl. Generations of tradition, that's what the lawyer said, as if that somehow justified erasing me from my own story. Questions ricocheted inside me. Didn't my father see me as capable? Was I ever more than just a supporting player in a legacy scripted by and for men? It wasn't about the money, though the scale of it was staggering, but about being denied the chance to shape what I had spent my life upholding. As the meeting stumbled to a close, legal jargon blurring at the edges, I locked eyes with Jordan. There was an awkwardness, a weight neither of us knew how to voice. I stepped outside onto the cold Manhattan street, tears burning behind my eyes, and realized in that instant that I couldn't let this be the end of my story. If the Kingsley legacy had survived decades of secrets and scandal, I resolved, then it would have to withstand the truth, even if I was the only one willing to speak it. Jordan, the golden boy. If you were to judge by appearances alone, you might never guess that Jordan Kingsley and I shared the same DNA, let alone the same last name. We were close enough in age, 3 years between us, practically raised shoulder to shoulder in the same brownstone, with the same nannies, tutors, and relentless expectations. But in every other way, my younger brother seemed cut from an entirely different cloth. I remember Jordan as a child, a cherub-faced boy with a quick, disarming smile, and the kind of curls that made little old ladies coo. Even then, he seemed to possess an uncanny knack for charming adults, for wriggling his way out of reprimands and coaxing a laugh out of even the sternest teachers. Where I tended to hide behind cautious words, imperfect posture, Jordan flourished in chaos. He was wild, unpredictable, a spark constantly flirting with disaster. By high school, his talent for finding loopholes and bending rules had become a kind of family legend. There was the time he snuck out after curfew to joyride a friend's Porsche and sweet-talk the doorman into not telling our parents, or the year he scored just high enough on his finals to keep him on the soccer team. then engineered a bogus tutoring program as his community service, after being caught orchestrating a prank on the headmaster. My parents, reportedly furious, merely shook their heads, half exasperated, half amused. "Boys will be boys," Dad would say, with an indulgent smile, as if Jordan's missteps were rough drafts for a future success story. It's not that my parents were blind to Jordan's flaws. My mother fretted constantly, nose buried in school reports and progress updates, simultaneously citing family honor while making subtle donations that seemed to smooth out every academic or social wrinkle. Yet, the more trouble Jordan attracted, the more attention he seemed to command. At family dinners, the conversation inevitably bent toward his antics, his latest wild story, his charming escapes, his endless appetite for risk. I, on the other hand, learned early that the surest way to be noticed was simply to never cause trouble at all. The differences became more pronounced after our father handed Jordan his first set of keys, a brand new BMW, a rite of passage none of the Kingsley women had ever been granted. I remember the way Jordan tossed them in the air, grinning, already planning the weekend escapes upstate with a revolving cast of friends. He wore privilege with a swagger I could never quite feign. If I attended the fundraisers and cocktail parties out of duty, Jordan attended out of sport, testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push the comfort of our family name. Our paths split even further when he went off to Yale, a tradition in our family for the men, while the women were usually nudged toward respectable East Coast colleges. Jordan lasted all of 4 semesters before word came home that he'd been suspended for university policy violations. The specifics were never openly discussed. My mother went to Connecticut for a weekend and returned with new curtains for the guest room and an unspoken resolve to never mention the Yale incident again. Every screw-up, every scandal, no matter how public or embarrassing, was treated behind closed doors with a curious mixture of frustration and pride. My parents seemed to believe that Jordan's rebellious streak, if properly harnessed, would somehow forge him into a more formidable heir. My father, perhaps seeing himself in his only son, embraced the tumult, convinced that Kingsley men were meant to break a few rules on their way to the top. Meanwhile, I moved quietly along the periphery. Academic achievement, charitable work, intern summers in my father's office, coffee runs, and spreadsheets, everything to prove that I could carry the family name too. But the honest truth is, I always felt invisible beside the glow of Jordan's magnified mischief. When Dad's health began to slip, a shadow that crept slowly through our lives, I saw the pressure start to press in on Jordan in ways neither of us had anticipated. The family firm was under review from regulators, and rumors about old business entanglements from my grandfather's era circulated in financial circles. Jordan, newly recast as the responsible one, was suddenly thrust into deal meetings, forced into Navy suits and half-day workshops on asset management. His eyes glazed over at budget reports. He resented being reined in. He missed parties, then attended them anyway, splashing on cologne to mask the whiskey breath. Sometimes, in rare moments of vulnerability, Jordan would slip into my room late at night with a bottle pilfered from the second-floor cabinet. He would sprawl across the bed, recount some ridiculous exploit, getting banned from yet another club, losing a bet to a Russian billionaire's son, crashing a yacht on the Hudson, and then go unusually quiet. "You ever feel like you're just expected to be someone else?" he asked me once, staring at the ceiling, the moonlight painting sharp lines across his face. "Every day," I replied, but I don't think he really heard me. Jordan and I shared a complicated bond. Siblings linked by blood and obligation, but divided by the insurmountable weight of expectation. Despite his recklessness, or maybe because of it, there was something heartbreakingly childlike about his desire to be seen, to be loved for who he really was. Our relationship oscillated between rivalry and reluctant alliance. There were moments when he'd look at me as if to say, "Aren't we both treading water here?" But when Father died, everything tilted. At the reading of the will, I caught the flicker of surprise in Jordan's eyes. As Mr. Benson read out the terms, I could see he hadn't expected to inherit the full weight of the Kingsley legacy. Or perhaps not so soon. His smirk was a facade, masking uncertainty, even fear. For all his bravado, Jordan did not seem triumphant. He seemed lost. Over the following weeks, I watched him buckle under new pressures. Lawyers and bankers crowded our living room, their jargon thick as evening fog. Dispensing advice Jordan neither wanted nor understood. Their deference to him was overt, thinly veiled behind handshakes and forced smiles, pointedly not offered to me. My mother hovered, a mixture of pride and anxious hope, still convinced this forced responsibility would finally mature her son. But the shadow of doubt hung over Jordan, and all the parties and flashy escapades in the world couldn't conceal it. He began to pull away, lashing out at me when I tried to help, blaming me for playing the perfect daughter. Sometimes I wondered whether inheriting the Kingsley fortune was a reward for him, or just another gilded cage. Still, beneath the resentment and bravado, I recognized my brother. The same reckless spark burned behind his eyes, now flickering with panic and self-doubt. And for the first time, I pitied him, not because he had everything, but because he'd inherited a legacy built on expectations he could never possibly fulfill. Looking back, I realize our story was never really about the money or the inheritance. It was about two very different people, thrown together by blood and fate, both desperate to be seen and valued for who they truly were, even as the world kept forcing us into roles neither of us had chosen. Quietly, making a plan. If you'd told me as a child that I'd one day wage a secret war within my own family, I would have laughed it off as melodrama, unbefitting the Kingsley name. Everything in our household was about image, tradition, and keeping the peace. No one raised their voice, except perhaps in celebration at a gala or during a particularly competitive Scrabble match. But after the reading of the will, something in me hardened, a stubborn, quiet resolve. Maybe it was anger, maybe it was heartbreak, or maybe it was the realization that, for the first time, I had nothing to lose. For a few days after the lawyer's office, I wandered through our house in a daze. My mother retreated into her rituals, flawless breakfast trays delivered to untouched bedrooms, endless phone calls to relatives, suffocating small talk with well-meaning neighbors who dropped off casseroles for the bereaved. Jordan was out, predictably, vanishing for days at a time with his old crowd, surfacing only for perfunctory appearances or lukewarm family dinners, where conversation could barely scrape the surface of, "How was your day?" I tried to process my feelings and hit a wall at every turn. Sadness, yes, but also a white-hot betrayal. Not just by my father, whose love I'd never doubted, but by the system my family had always served. All my life, I'd done what was asked, followed the rules, played the part of the loyal daughter. Yet here I was, excluded for the one thing I could never change, being born a girl. One morning, I found myself in my father's study, a place that still smelled of his cologne, in the faint, earthy scent of old books. I had always been allowed in here, but rarely long enough to do more than hand him a coffee or review a spreadsheet. This time, it felt different, almost like trespassing. I sat at his desk, running my fingers over the stack of ledgers, files, and family memorabilia, carefully curated remnants of a life measured in achievements and assets. The light filtering through the tall windows made dust motes shimmer like gold. On a whim, I opened the bottom drawer, half expecting it to be locked. To my surprise, it yielded, revealing a set of handwritten journals and a leather-bound folder, embossed with the Kingsley crest. Curiosity pushed me past guilt. I began leafing through the documents, each page more revealing than the last. Records of business meetings, pages of personal reflections during economic downturns, and, oddly, a few letters that read more like coded warnings than correspondence between friends. Every so often, a phrase would leap out: old obligations, risk if found, protect the name. But any true meaning was shrouded in ambiguity. For the first time in my life, I found myself questioning what exactly we were protecting. The restlessness that had been plaguing me since the will grew into a plan, vague at first, but gaining shape with each sleepless night. I would not accept the hand I'd been dealt. I wanted answers. If I couldn't have a seat at the table by invitation, maybe I could force one by unearthing the truth buried beneath our family's gilded exterior. But I knew better than to act rashly. The Kingsleys did not survive 3 generations of Manhattan real estate, finance, and social maneuvering by being careless. My father had always warned, "Don't pick a fight unless you know what you're really fighting for." Secrets have ways of surviving, even when we think they're long dead. Still, sometimes secrets are exactly what need to die. What I needed most was an ally, someone outside the family who was bound by law, not loyalty. The idea of hiring a lawyer made my hands sweat. After all, what kind of child takes legal action over her own inheritance, against her own blood? But as I stared at the cryptic entries in my father's journals, I realized this wasn't about money anymore. It was about truth, about my right, not just to the family's legacy, but to its real history. I started my search in the least conspicuous way possible, by trawling the websites of law firms specializing in estate cases and family law. Most were impersonal, filled with bland language about compassionate care and stock images of gavel-wielding attorneys. I almost gave up until I stumbled on a profile that stood out. Raymond Reynolds, Cromwell and Strand, LLC. Specialists in complex inheritance disputes and discreet client advocacy. The reviews painted a picture of a man who believed in justice more than networking, a rare commodity in New York's legal jungle. I picked up the phone before I could overthink it. My voice shook a little as I introduced myself to his receptionist, but I managed to make an appointment under the strictest confidentiality. The Kingsley name seemed to have a gravitational pull. It could open doors, for better or worse. The following Tuesday, I found myself sitting in a high-rise office, staring out over the cityscape, waiting for a stranger to appear, and, I hoped, to change the course of my life. When Mr. Reynolds entered, I was surprised by how unassuming he looked. Silver hair, a loosely knotted tie, and the kind of sharp but tired eyes that told you he'd seen both the best and worst of people. We shook hands. "What can I do for you, Miss Kingsley?" he asked, voice steady, unhurried. I hesitated. This was the crossroads. A single sentence, and I'd be shifting the axis of everything I knew. I recounted the reading of the will, my exclusion, the tradition, my brother's appointment as sole heir. I told him about my suspicions, how things didn't add up, about the cryptic references in my father's writing, about my gut feeling that tradition was a smokescreen for something much darker. He didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded, listening intently, jotting down a few notes, but mostly letting me talk. When I finished, he leaned back. "Ms. Kingsley, there are two kinds of secrets in families like yours, the kind that protect and the kind that destroy. If you're sure you're ready to find out which is which, I'll help you. But understand, once you begin, there's almost never a way to pretend you don't know the truth." Hearing that, I realized I'd already crossed that line. Just by sitting in this office, we discussed next steps. Discretion would be everything. Any paper trail would draw attention, especially from my mother or from Jordan. I agreed to communicate from a private email, never using family devices. Mr. Reynolds warned me to be ready for what we might uncover: finances, old deals, maybe even criminality buried deep enough to be almost invisible, but which New York's courts would take seriously if brought to light. The real work began that night. I returned home and began sifting through my father's belongings in earnest. No one noticed. My mother believed grief made me restless. Jordan was rarely around, except to bash out angry chords on the family's baby grand piano or crash on the couch between hangovers. I copied files from my father's computer onto encrypted USB drives. I photographed pages of ledgers and letters, checking bank statements for withdrawals that didn't match any known expenses. Every little discovery felt illicit, a betrayal and a relief at once. It was exhausting work. I stayed up, poring over records until dawn. What started as suspicions soon led to patterns: shell corporations with links to offshore accounts, large donations made to charities that seemed to exist only on paper. There were memos referencing old construction deals from decades ago, the 80s and 90s, when Manhattan real estate was a blood sport, and rules were apparently written in pencil. The same names kept reappearing in the margins of my father's notes. Old family friends, men who now showed up at our Thanksgiving dinners, whose children I'd greeted politely for years. Part of me was terrified. What if I dragged the family name through mud that could never be cleaned? Our reputation, for all its power, was still fragile, but part of me was exhilarated, almost for the first time. I wasn't just a placeholder in the Kingsley legacy. I was the only one in the family actually working for the truth. Mr. Reynolds reached out every few days, careful and deliberate. Sometimes he'd ask for specific files or for clarification about a transaction or name. Other times, he'd simply listen as I described my progress or vented my frustration at the inertia that seemed built into wealth and secrecy. He clearly took pains to keep me anchored. "You're walking a fine line, Emily," he said during one call. "You're not just looking for a technicality. You're building a story, a narrative that shows intention, not just mistakes. Be prepared, if this ever sees the light of court, that you'll be cross-examined, as will your family." The prospect didn't scare me as much as it might once have. What frightened me now was what would happen if I did nothing. If I let Jordan inherit all this, oblivious or indifferent to the house of cards he was set to control. If I walked away, I would be complicit in preserving a lie, simply for comfort's sake. The weeks that followed were a blur. I learned the value of shadows, how to move quietly, how to make myself invisible in my own home. I began visiting libraries and public archives, searching old news reports and municipal records. There were stories about Kingsley Holdings from the 1980s, sudden expansions, a warehouse fire that was ruled accidental but mentioned in my father's notes as taken care of. Every answer led to another question, each detail a thread, pulled from the perfectly woven tapestry my family had spent generations cultivating. I saw less and less of my brother, who suspected nothing. My mother seemed only to age, her movements becoming more brittle, her routines more desperate. I wondered if she, too, harbored secrets, or if decades of turning the other cheek had trained her not to see what didn't conveniently fit. Through it all, what surprised me most wasn't the darkness in my family's past. It was the clarity that came with seeking the truth, and the strange freedom in knowing that, for the first time, I was forging my own narrative, not simply reciting the script I'd been handed at birth. By the end of those first months, I had pieced together enough to realize that my family's legacy was not as untouchable as the world believed. And as I organized the evidence, documents, timelines, shell company monikers, and cryptic memos, I knew the next step would be the hardest yet. Not merely collecting the truth, but deciding how much of it to reveal and what price I was truly willing to pay for justice. Uncovering the dark past. There is something chillingly surreal about watching your family's carefully constructed world start to crack and knowing that you're the one holding the chisel. As days bled into weeks, the secrets hidden within our family name became a living presence in my life. They lurked behind every closed door in our brownstone and echoed in the marble halls after midnight. The deeper I dug, the more I felt the weight of surveillance, as though the very walls might be watching, remembering, and judging every move I made. I'd like to believe I started with noble intentions, the pursuit of fairness, the dream of stepping into my father's shoes on equal footing, the hope of reimagining the Kingsley legacy as something cleaner, more transparent. But as I pieced together the tangled web of lies, the righteous anger that fueled me burned away, leaving behind a colder, sobering resolve. This wasn't just about what was owed to me. This was about the truth and how it can both destroy and redeem. My collaboration with Mr. Reynolds became a clandestine rhythm. Weekdays, I performed as the loyal daughter grieving her father, nodding somberly at condolences and pretending to listen to my mother's endless lists of people to thank. In the quiet hours after midnight, I transformed into a silent investigator, sorting encrypted flash drives, scanning old property deeds, and paging through my father's journals with fluorescent sticky notes and feverish hands. The process was not glamorous. There were false leads, cryptic notations, and financial statements written with the kind of mathematical precision only an accountant or a criminal could love. Still, patterns revealed themselves through repetition. Certain offshore bank codes and recurring names, old business partners, former board members, childhood uncles, whose faces I only recalled from the background of holiday photos, started appearing everywhere. I soon realized the family fortune, so often boasted as old money, had been anything but clean across generations. I'll never forget the night I found the letter from 1987, wedged between tax documents in a battered file folder. It was handwritten, the ink faded, the script hurried, but unmistakably my grandfather's. It referenced a settlement in Jersey City, an agreement with city officials after an incident at the wharf. The tone was urgent, defensive, colder than anything I'd ever read from the Kingsley patriarch. There were numbers, amounts transferred through a law firm in Delaware, crossed out and rewritten, with final sums far exceeding any normal business transaction. My hands shook as I realized the incident had been a warehouse fire that killed 2 workers, something my father had always insisted was a tragic accident. What stunned me more was how meticulously the facts had been hidden. I learned how Kingsley Holdings maintained a maze of shell corporations, some linked to real estate, others to art, others only in name, shuffling assets and liabilities whenever scrutiny threatened. The names of the beneficiaries and board members rotated with the seasons, making any real pattern hard to follow. But in the files my father had hidden, the same signatures surfaced. Old family friends, covering for each other, rival families keeping quiet, and public officials whose sons now played tennis with my brother in the Hamptons. By early spring, Mr. Reynolds and I had amassed a trove of evidence: scanned checks, backdated contracts, confidential settlements, incriminating correspondence, and a chronological nightmare of deals that stretched back to Manhattan's wild real estate booms in the 80s and 90s. In one journal entry from 1992, my father wrote, "Risk is necessary for survival, but secrets compound interest in ways money never could." I felt the full gravity of that sentiment as I stared at spreadsheets detailing community donations that coincided with building permits or loan forgiveness to city inspectors right before code violations were cleared. Every answer led to more disturbing questions. Was my grandfather's stroke hastened by the stress of blackmail in his final years? Did my father's obsession with reputation stem from guilt as much as from pride? How many Kingsley family Christmases featured laughter above a pile of gifts paid for with money that might have cost someone else their life? One day, as the rain hammered the city, I sat in the study with Mr. Reynolds, surrounded by files and digital backups, the fruits of our months of subterfuge. He poured us both black coffee and finally asked the question that had been haunting both of us. "What do you want to do with all this, Emily?" I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to run, to pack my bags, leave the city, and let the ghosts of Kingsley Holdings devour themselves without me. But to do that, I would be no better than my ancestors, hiding from hard truths, so I could keep dining at the table of privilege. "We take it public," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But we do it right. I don't want a scandal for the sake of drama. I want a reckoning." Mr. Reynolds nodded approvingly, but the gravity of my decision quickly sank in. Exposing the past would mean war, against my own flesh and blood, against people powerful enough to reshape headlines, and against the very city that had celebrated my family's name for generations. I worried about my mother, who had lived a life of denial and social grace, and about Jordan, who was finally beginning to realize that being the chosen one came at a soul-crushing price. Strategizing the leak was a project in itself. Mr. Reynolds suggested we approach a high-profile investigative journalist, someone reputable and fearless, unlikely to be bought off or intimidated. After careful deliberation, we set up a meeting with Claire Hartwell, a Pulitzer winner known for uncovering corporate corruption in America's elite circles. I reached out anonymously at first, sending a cryptic email and a handful of redacted documents as proof of authenticity. Meeting Claire in person felt like stepping into yet another role: a whistleblower, a traitor, maybe even a hero. She was sharp, professional, and immediately understood the stakes. "Let me be clear," she said, eyes unwavering. "Once you set this in motion, you can't walk it back. No one in your world ever forgives a woman who goes against her blood." I nodded, aware that this would be the cost of my freedom. For the next several weeks, we worked covertly. Claire built a timeline from my files, triple-checking every fact, verifying sources, arranging interviews. Nothing would be published until every claim could stand up to legal and public scrutiny. All the while, my family came undone in slow motion. Jordan grew increasingly erratic, disappearing for days, calling me in the early morning hours and hanging up when I answered. My mother's routines became frantic. She cleaned rooms twice, misplaced the same jewelry, snapped at the house staff for minor infractions. Her eyes, once perpetually masked in pride, grew hollow and fearful. Night after night, I lay awake, listening to Manhattan's endless hum, picturing the faces of the people I was betraying. Was I saving them, or just pushing the inevitable collapse that my ancestors had spent their lives warding off? I feared becoming a pariah, the prodigal daughter who burned her inheritance to the ground. The evening before the story broke, I walked through Central Park, the city bathed in the violet glow of spring twilight. I lingered on a bridge, watching couples stroll beneath the budding cherry trees, and realized I no longer belonged to that world, the world of illusion and power, where secrets were currency and silence was survival. The next morning, Claire's exposé ran on the front page. The headline was less explosive than I'd expected, but more damning. Old money, new lies, inside the Kingsley fortune. Within hours, my phone was ablaze with calls and messages. Lawyers, extended family, reporters, old classmates, vague acquaintances, suddenly desperate to know the real story. Our family PR consultant issued a terse statement about reviewing the facts and committing to transparency. Behind closed doors, the mood was apocalyptic. Jordan refused to see me. My mother locked herself in her suite and ignored all attempts at comfort. I expected judgment and anger, and I got more than my share. But what surprised me was the undercurrent of relief that emerged. Relief from family friends who had always suspected something darker beneath our surface. And, almost heartbreakingly, from a few of the very insiders implicated. About time, one former board member texted, his message anonymous, except for the initials I recognized from a stack of faded letters. Thanks to Mr. Reynolds's meticulous legal preparation, the evidence was bulletproof. Within weeks, regulators launched formal investigations. Assets were frozen. The Kingsley name, once synonymous with elegance, now trended alongside words like fraud and cover-up. It was humiliating and, in a way, liberating. Still, not everything was lost. The city was angry, but not everyone turned their backs. Some old friends quietly offered their support. Strangers emailed to thank me for being brave. Even Jordan, after months of silence, sent a message late one night. Just a single word. Why? I didn't answer, because some truths are too tangled to fit in a text. I experienced exhaustion, unlike anything I'd felt before. I moved out of the brownstone. The future of our family business was uncertain, our assets tied up in years of litigation. Yet, for all that I had lost, status, reputation, easy acceptance into a world I once believed was mine by birthright, I felt as if I could finally breathe. Truth, I learned, is never clean. It wounds and splits, and sometimes even destroys. But in that destruction, there is a strange, hard-won kind of hope. The hope that maybe, when the debris clear, what remains might finally be real. Facing the family, in the weeks after the exposé shattered the Kingsley image, the brownstone on East 72nd Street felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The marble floors, polished to a mirror sheen for decades, now echoed with a coldness I'd never known. The velvet curtains muffled the city's steady pulse, and each grand chandelier seemed to dim under the heaviness settling. Across every room, there were no more dinner parties or noisy family breakfasts. Instead, silence hung like a thick shroud, and navigating the hallways of my childhood felt like wandering through a museum of ghosts. I hadn't planned what I'd do after the truth came out. There had been countless nights spent diagramming worst-case scenarios with Mr. Reynolds, legal threats, tabloid ambushes, bitter phone calls from distant relatives. But I'd underestimated the magnitude of the storm I'd unleashed inside my own home. For the first time in my life, the Kingsley name didn't open doors or smooth problems away. It marked me as the traitor, the turncoat who had aired generations of dirty laundry for the world to see. After Claire Hartwell's article, I moved out, taking only a suitcase, my father's journals, and a decade's worth of guilt. My phone lit up every hour. Some messages were from lawyers, others from former friends, severing ties with carefully worded texts. A few from journalists hungry for more. But the ones I dreaded most were from my family. Dozens of missed calls from my mother. A handful of terse, cryptic voicemails from Jordan, and an ever-growing silence that stretched between us all. I avoided their calls at first. I told myself I needed space to think, to breathe, to finally live outside the script I'd played since birth. Yet every step I took outside the Kingsley orbit only amplified my anxiety. I rented a poorly heated studio across the park, unpacked my few belongings, and sat for hours at night on a squeaky window seat, watching Manhattan's lights flicker. No matter how far I felt from my old life, I couldn't shake the sense that something unfinished dragged me back. The reckoning had gone public, but the reckoning within the family was only just beginning. It was my mother who reached out first. Her message was calm, almost eerily so. "Emily, we need to speak. Please come home. It's important." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to erase the message and throw my phone into the river. Another part, the daughter who still craved her approval, her reassurance, was already grabbing her coat and hailing a cab. The ride back to the brownstone was a blur of city lights and dread. When the elevator doors opened, I found the place transformed. The staff were gone, replaced by temporary help. The foyer was clogged with boxes of official documents and folders delivered by various legal teams. My mother was waiting, standing next to a table stacked with unopened letters and wilted condolence flower arrangements. She looked smaller than I remembered, older somehow. Her posture was stiff, her hair pulled back with the kind of precision she reserved for days she expected to be photographed. Her eyes, though, gave her away. They were rimmed in fatigue and something harder, hurt, perhaps, or the brittle edge of survival. We stood in silence for a moment, each waiting for the other to flinch. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp, not the soothing, rehearsed cadence she used for social occasions, but something rawer. "You didn't have to do it this way, Emily. Whatever you think you accomplished, all you've done is destroy what your father and I spent our lives protecting." I opened my mouth, then closed it again. All the arguments I'd carefully collected over months felt suddenly childish, reductive. I wanted to shout that it wasn't my doing, that it was the secrets themselves, not their exposure, that caused the ruin. But I couldn't muster the energy for a fight that felt, in some ways, timeless. She continued, softer now. "You've made us the target of every investigator and every headline. Do you realize what this means for your brother? For me?" I wanted to ask if she realized what it had always meant for me. Always the bystander, the scapegoat, for the privilege I was born into, yet denied from truly owning. Instead, I said, "It had to end, Mom. The lying, the cover-ups, pretending we were special just because we were hiding things better than everyone else. You can't build anything real on rot." She shook her head, almost pityingly. "You don't understand how this world works. Power protects itself. You think you've changed something, but all you've done is put a target on our backs. For what? For principle. The world won't thank you." The urge to cry, to beg for her approval one last time, swelled in my chest, but I didn't. I stood straighter, feeling every inch the outsider, and yet, finally, something like my own person. I didn't do this for thanks. I did it because, for the first time, I could live with myself. I hope that will be enough, she replied. We stood quietly, the rift between us wider than it had ever been. She left the room first, not in a dramatic flurry of tears or accusations, but with the slow, resigned step of someone whose best weapons had grown dull. Not long after, Jordan returned. We hadn't spoken since the news broke. He arrived late, letting the front door slam behind him, with an echo that shivered up the banister. My mother intercepted him in the foyer, her words muffled by the distance, but sharp enough for me to sense the tension. When he climbed the stairs, I met him in the hallway, breath held. "Emily," he said, voice cracking slightly. "Was it worth it?" I looked at him, really looked. Gone was the cocksure grin, the glimmer of untouchable arrogance. His eyes were bloodshot, face drawn. For the first time, I realized he looked more like Dad than ever, crumbling beneath the weight of a world he'd never chosen, but had no choice but to carry. "I don't know yet," I answered honestly, but I couldn't live with the alternative. He slumped against the wall, running a hand through his hair. For a moment, I thought he might scream or rail against me, blame me for all of it. Instead, his anger seemed to evaporate, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. "I didn't want any of this either, you know," he said, almost to himself. "I grew up thinking if I just played along, did what they wanted, eventually, I'd be the man Dad wanted. Now, none of it matters." "It does matter," I said, quieter this time. "What we do now matters. You don't have to keep pretending, Jordan." He stared at me, searching for an accusation that never came. What I saw in his eyes, confusion, grief, a spark of relief, echoed my own turmoil. For years, we'd been on opposite sides of an invisible barrier. Sister and brother, divided by roles neither of us had chosen. Now, all that was left was the truth, and the pain that came with it. Our conversation stretched into fragile confessions. His anger, my isolation, all the compromises we'd each made for a name we could never truly escape. He vented about the legal teams suffocating him with decisions he never wanted, about our mother's unyielding denial, about the friends who cared more about proximity to wealth than about him. I talked about what it felt like to be invisible, to play perfect while knowing perfection was just another form of exile. Somewhere near dawn, we sat together on the steps of the old service staircase, sharing the memories we'd never admitted to anyone else. The time we'd snuck out as children to buy ice cream at midnight. The terror and awe we felt at our father's rare praise. The nights we'd each lain in bed, privately wishing for a different life. As the sun slowly rose, painting the skyline in gold, I realized that the biggest battles weren't fought in courtrooms or splashed across headlines, but in the flesh and blood rooms of family homes. I wished I could offer Jordan forgiveness, or that he could offer me understanding, but we were both too raw for grace, our wounds too fresh for neat conclusions. That morning, I called a family meeting. For the first time, it was just the three of us. No lawyers, no assistants, no scripts. My mother arrived in silence, Jordan trailing her, coffee clutched in one shaking hand. "I know there's nothing I can say to fix what's happened," I began. "I know I broke something by going public, but the truth is, it was broken a long time ago. Covering it up would have just bought us more time, not actual peace." My mother looked away, lips pressed thin. Jordan nodded, eyes fixed on his coffee. I pressed on. "We can hate each other. We can pretend the world forced our hand, or we can figure out what comes next, together. even if it means starting over from nothing. No one jumped at the offer. I hadn't expected them to, but in the days that followed, the silence between us softened. Jordan started answering my texts. My mother and I exchanged fewer words, but when we did, they were honest, free of the rehearsed polish that had defined our relationship for decades. In the end, facing my family wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to turn away from the consequences. It was standing in the aftermath, battered but unbowed, insisting on something real between us, even if real meant admitting that love and loyalty are sometimes the most tangled truths of all. Looking back, I don't picture a dramatic confrontation, but a series of small, painful reckonings. There were no grand apologies, no hugs that tied everything up with a bow. But there was, finally, the possibility of something new. Relationships built not on image or inheritance, but on the tentatively shared understanding of truth and the freedom to decide our own futures. And that, far more than reclaiming wealth or reputation, felt like the first step toward being whole. A new ending for me. It is a strange thing to let go of the life you always thought you wanted. In the months following the family reckoning, I discovered that endings, real endings, rarely arrive in a single thunderclap. Instead, they seep in slowly, like rainwater through old stone, reshaping not just your world, but the person you thought you were meant to become. The Kingsleys, as Manhattan had known us, were finished. In the wake of the revelations, our last traces of untouchable grandeur faded like old photographs. News cycles moved on from our scandal, but the legal process, as promised, was glacial and merciless. My days became a kaleidoscope of affidavits and testimonies, depositions and court appearances, as the state meticulously unwound decades of our financial machinery. I should have felt vindicated, watching the old order dissolve under the bright light of justice. But the reality was exhausting, humbling, and, at times, heartbreaking. The months of litigation blurred together, punctuated by public statements and terse meetings with new attorneys, ones appointed by the court, independent of the old guard who'd shielded my family for so long. Early on, there was real fear that we'd lose everything: the penthouse, the summer houses, the art collection sifted through by investigators in white gloves. But when the time came for the estate to be divided, something unexpected happened. For the first time in my life, the law treated me as an equal. The ruling wasn't as dramatic as the headlines suggested. There were no gloating victories. Instead, the judge delivered a carefully reasoned order. The assets of Kingsley Holdings and the family trust would be divided evenly, regardless of gender. My mother, frail and silent beside me, wept quietly, not for the money, but for a world she could no longer return to. Jordan sat behind the table in the hearing room, shoulders hunched, his boyish arrogance replaced by a grim sort of maturity. There was no celebration, but there was a deep, cleansing sense of relief. I did not fight for justice, just to acquire stock portfolios or paintings. I fought to prove, to myself, and perhaps to every girl born into a closed world, that birthright did not have to mean silence. Still, money couldn't repair what had been broken. The family business, once so revered, was fractured and restructured under regulatory oversight. Many employees lost jobs. Favorite charities had funding frozen. Our family name, the scaffolding of my identity, had become a punchline whispered at benefit dinners. I had braced myself for the world's cruelty. But in the end, it was the quieter losses that bruised deepest. Yet, even as one identity fell apart, another slowly formed. I moved into my own apartment, a smallish, sunlit walk-up in Chelsea, worlds away from marble and old money hush. The first morning I woke there, I could smell the bakery downstairs and hear the subway rumble through the pipes. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to look at my own reflection. I had no staff, no endless obligations, and every object in my home was something I had chosen and paid for myself. I kept my father's journals locked in the top desk drawer, evidence not of his ambition or his crimes, but of the complicated, incomplete man he truly was. Sometimes, late at night, I reread passages, his pride in Jordan, his worries about me, his tangled efforts to honor a legacy built on sand. Where once I read them for clues and ammunition, now I read them for understanding. He loved us, I think, as best he knew how, even if his love required too many sacrifices. My relationship with my mother became something both harder and more honest. We didn't try to pretend anymore. Her grief for my father and for the life she could no longer curate made her irritable, even mean, in ways it had never before. But slowly, ever so slowly, a mutual respect grew. I had forced change on her world, and she saw that I was willing to pay the price for it. Occasionally, she would call, her voice tremulous, asking about a legal notice or the logistics of finding a new apartment. For once, she didn't lecture. Sometimes we talked about the past, about things neither of us had said to my father. There is comfort in truth, even when it cuts. Jordan's evolution was slower, messier. At first, he disappeared, vanishing into circles that had once worshipped our name before shunning us as an embarrassment. There were rumors of bar fights, of depression and debts, of new schemes to claim what was left of the old Kingsley fortune. But over time, necessity forced him to change. He enrolled in a business program, not at an Ivy, but at a city school, and took a part-time job in property management. Every so often, he came by with a six-pack and stories about his disastrous first attempts at adulthood. We never spoke again about the will or the scandal. Instead, we built something smaller and quieter together, shared memories, hard-won forgiveness, the stubborn loyalty of siblings who had survived the same fire. I didn't rescue him, nor did he rescue me. We both had to learn to swim. As the dust settled, what remained was not what the Kingsleys had once valued. Not the lavish homes, nor the invitations, nor the places on old society boards. What remained was the thrum of possibility that comes only after you've been stripped bare. I had thought that winning my inheritance would mean regaining power, restoring some birthright. But in practice, inheritance meant something else entirely. It meant the freedom to write my own story, unanchored by the old lies. I decided not to revive the family firm or cling to the past's trappings. Instead, I used part of my share to fund a nonprofit legal clinic specializing in women's estate rights, devoted to helping daughters, wives, sisters who found themselves invisible in their own families' legacies. It was harder work than I expected, often thankless, but for the first time in my life, I woke eager to fight for causes more important than social appearances. The clinic drew headlines and eventually respect from people who cared little for the Kingsley name. Most days, that was enough. On a sunny March afternoon, almost a year from the day the will was read, I visited my old block on East 72nd. The brownstone was gutted, waiting for new owners with no memory of winter galas or piano recitals, of secret glances exchanged between siblings hiding from grown-up burdens. I stood across the street, remembering the child who watched the city from behind gold-rimmed windows, unaware of how fragile glass could be. I didn't feel anger. I felt gratitude for having escaped, for having spoken, for having the chance to forge a life where silence no longer defined me. There are still days when I grieve for what was lost. Family, for all its failings, is the original country you are born into and never entirely leave. I imagine my father's voice in moments of weakness. Would he hate me for what I did? Or, somewhere in the honesty of my defiance, would he recognize the courage he'd praised in public? I suppose I will never know, but the ache has softened with time, replaced by a strange pride. Not the pride of the Kingsley crest or a celebrated last name, but the pride of a woman who faced the truth and dared to demand more. When I think about a new ending, I realize it is really a beginning. I am not naive. The world will always have its gatekeepers, its silent collusions, its price for change. I have scars and regrets enough to remind me of that. But I also have the knowledge that sometimes, when you lose everything you were supposed to protect, you find the space to imagine the life you actually want. I no longer introduce myself at parties as Emily Kingsley. I am Emily, daughter, sister, advocate, survivor. My story is not carved in marble, but written in the ordinary acts of rebuilding, helping a client win a case, sharing a laugh with Jordan over cheap pizza, sending my mother a birthday card with more truth than apology. I have learned that the price of telling the truth is steep, but what you gain is priceless. The ability to live without hiding, to love without lying, and to wake each day free. That is the ending. No, the beginning. I finally choose for myself.